Welcome to the Pro-Life Team podcast. I'm Elizabeth Wanning. I'm co-founder of Changed Movement and executive director of Advocacy for them. And we're going to be talking about some of the ideas, the fundamental underlying ideas behind transgender experience and how pregnancy care centers can come alongside people who are wanting to detransition, to move away from gender identity politics to receive health and wholeness.
So, Elizabeth, I'm excited to have you on the Pro-Life Team podcast. Would you introduce yourself as if you were talking to, let's say, some executive directors from pregnancy clinics, which is probably not a group you often talk to, but that's one of the audience that I try and speak to in this podcast.
That's awesome. It's a privilege to be able to do that. So I am co-founder with Ken Williams. We're both pastors at Bethel Church in Redding, California. We are co-founders of the organization called Changed Movement. And Changed essentially is an advocacy and ministry an organization that serves people who are questioning their sexuality or who have questioned their sexuality and are navigating away from LGBT rather than toward it. We hear a lot about the queer space, the LGBTQ space, and everyone presumes that if you're in that Q space, then you're leaning towards identifying as LGBT. But we represent all the people who are questioning their sexuality and who might find themselves in that space, but really don't want to head in that direction. Either ideologically, they don't want to go in that direction or per their conscience, or they've had some past life experience that informs their sense of sexuality, like abuse or molestation. So, I mean, most of what I do is I advocate in the public policy realm. So Ken focuses more on pastoral ministry and pastoral care. I'm executive director of advocacy and government affairs. And so I tend to focus in the spaces where state legislation is being debated or whether public policies on the LGBT realm is being debated.
Yeah, and this is, I would say in the past, the pregnancy clinics have not taken on this lane or this topic when it comes to trying to provide care. But I'd like to give you a little backstory as to why I wanted to do this podcast and really to share where I think things are going, at least from my perspective. So about 4 weeks ago, I visited every abortion clinic website that I could as part of a keyword research project that I'm still working on today. And as part of visiting about 188 abortion clinic websites, and then considering what I saw on those sites, I would say that about 70% seem to have transgender surgeries listed on their list of services. And this is including single county, one office abortion clinics that offer, many of them offer 3 services, like abortion services, the transgender surgeries, and then something that may actually be healthcare, a 3rd service. And so all that to say is thinking about, why were there so many? I knew that Planned Parenthood had been offering transgender surgery services for, well, I'm not sure how long, but let's just call it a long time. But I did not know that these smaller offices, these smaller abortion clinics were also doing it. And so many times these pregnancy clinics are strategically located next door to an abortion clinic. And if these abortion clinics are now offering transgender surgeries, in order for us to provide care or alternative, a better, healthier alternative to people walking in to an abortion clinic, the thought is what would that look like for us to be able to answer that need as well? And so, being able to offer it either by offering a referral to a mental health counseling or psychologist or mental health counseling service that would be faith-based or biblically grounded. And so that's really why I reached out to your group, was to ask, well, one question was, is there a national network where we could refer people to who need mental health counseling and psychologists? And eventually, I think the referrals will start anywhere from months from now to 1.5 years. And then I think some pricing clinics will start to offer in-house counseling and psychology services for some of those audience, some of the people walking towards an abortion clinic, as a way to answer that need. So let's start there. Is there what kind of network might there be to refer people to, or find someone?
It's interesting. So I was excited to connect with you and get this introduction because a few years ago, as I said, I'm in California. Now, you can't go any more affirming, really, in the United States. I know that Vermont and Massachusetts would argue, but I really think we would top any state in the U.S. in terms of advocacy for the LGBT community. And so a few years ago, we were addressing some legislation that had been proposed. It ultimately passed. It was focusing on creating a subsidy for transgender care. So it was called at that point, the Transgender Wellness Care Act. And it was proposing to create a fund that would support transgender-led organizations that provided psychological care, medical care, and spiritual care to the trans community. Well, I mean, our organization is comprised of many people who have detransitioned. And so as I was meeting with legislators about this bill, I ended up pondering and thinking, would we qualify for that subsidy? And when I began pitching that to some of the progressive legislators, it caused kind of a disruption in the force. Like, how would we deny a detransitioned individual, someone who once identified as transgender, maybe even had surgeries, how would we deny them a right to this care? Like, who really is transgender really was behind that. And so as I began thinking about that, in that same season, so that was probably 2020, the trans topic was taking off in an amazing way. And I was connecting with so many endocrinologists and scientists, researchers, medical doctors who are also in the advocacy space with me, and trying to put together this legislation that would kind of slow down the train on transitioning children. And in that season, I met with a friend who had been at ADF and now is in your world now. And his pregnancy care center was meeting needs from the LGBT community who had sexually transmitted diseases. So I was offering maybe some cultural insight, cultural education to him and his team. And I began thinking, so in that season, there were no, and there are no currently, medically accepted standards of care. So no consensus on standards of care for people who want to detransition. And that is the same today. So while you might have heard of like organizations like WPATH, who have so-called standards of care that are supposedly medical oriented and offer best practices for physical care, actually mostly WPATH is an ideological organization comprised of many disciplines. And so, and even in the U.S., the U.S. Endocrine Society, their standard of care doesn't acknowledge current science on the transgender topic. And so I was trying to build consensus in a network of scientists and practitioners, medical practitioners, can we put together standards of care? And that's when I had this idea of, well, who would be able to provide this care? And the easiest and most obvious answer was pregnancy care centers. Because of what you're talking about, that since Planned Parenthood has entered into that space, the most obvious place for people to find the kind of care they might need to back out of their progression towards transition is a pregnancy care center. You have like-minded counselors, probably. You have like-minded medical practitioners. And so the safety, because right now, one of the issues if you're trying to detransition and you want psychological care, it's actually very difficult to find a licensed counselor who will provide that for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is ideological. The other is because of conversion therapy bans. So most states with conversion therapy bans would restrict any kind of care to a minor, and that also any kind of detransition counseling care to a minor, if you can picture that. And so that also puts a chilling effect on the counseling world for adults. Even though, so if you're 18 and you're in that are you a minor, are you not space, the time when really you'd be going after those transition drugs, many counselors are reticent to offer care. And so pregnancy care centers are the perfect milieu or environment to start cultivating this nationwide network of detransition care. It's a long,
I wasn't expecting it to come back.
To get to you in that. The short answer is there are not yet very many national organizations that are offering counseling care, mainly because because of those two reasons, ideological reasons, but then also because of the conversion therapy ban space.
Wow. So I was really hoping that there was going to be a network that we could have just looked up a local physician or counselor or psychologist and provided someone with a referral. And then eventually some clinics would then join that network. So that's interesting. It's really interesting. Your response is very intriguing. It might take me a while to consider just what the ramifications of what that really, that's an interesting response.
Yeah. I mean, so another interesting factor is that most of the storm of transgender, you want to call it medical care. I don't. So
okay.
Most of the storm of the transgender wave of ideology that's hitting right now is so new. There really isn't much medical science supporting it. So you don't go to a university and learn how to transition someone, and you don't go to a university to learn how to detransition someone. And in the counseling space, you certainly don't go to university to learn how to detransition someone. Not if you're a licensed counselor through the APA, for example. And so we're in this place right now where just new information is being pursued, would be the best word.
So in my mind, so back in 1973 with Roe versus Wade, there was this big wave when it came to abortion becoming legal in every state, whereas it was legal in some states and illegal in some before that. And it feels like this transgender, this new wave, maybe it started a decade ago, maybe it started, part of it started with marriage, the Supreme Court decision when it comes to gay marriage. But it also seems like the Dobbs decision, making abortion, essentially signaling that abortion was going to become less accessible and less profitable, was probably the biggest spike that my gut seems to identify when it comes to the LGBTQIA plus wave increasing, because it feels like this group of doctors who are willing to take on this, the procedure of abortion are also willing to take on the procedure of LGBTQIA transitions. And I feel like they're in the same moral classification.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also think that the series of surgeries that it takes for someone to transition seems to be, and I don't know the details, but it looks like it would have several more dollar signs than an abortion because of the lifetime of care and because of the having 7 surgeries compared to having 1 procedure. And then having the lifetime of care seems to also just indicate greater opportunity to, receive insurance coverage and having just a large amount of money pour in from each client.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could look even beyond that, even further back, to see that demand for abortion has been on the decline. And so I think that 2 things have kind of happened at once, and whether it was an intentional conspiracy or not, who could know? Maybe it's the spirits of darkness, but so as Roe v. Wade, as I would say, the social conservative push against abortion has been successful in educating the younger generation about the impacts of abortion, but generally, even for women, the impacts of contraception and hormone therapies in that whole realm. Planned Parenthood has strategically seen the forefront of the kinds of medicines that are going to be required in this space. It's interesting. I think, ideologically, we could probably have an interesting conversation about what is happening with the identity of women, just generally. And I think that would be a very interesting and provocative conversation to have when Planned Parenthood is looking at trying to Planned Parenthood, so a little background on me. I came out as lesbian in my early 20s and lived in the gay community for several years. I went to seminary openly gay, so I was part of the gay affirming church movement. And when I finished my master's degree in theology and moved into parish ministry, I had an unexplainable experience with Jesus that caused me to begin questioning what I believed to be true about God. And that journey, that kind of existential crisis that I had at that point, led me to do an entire deconstruction, if you will, of my faith at that point. And the outcome of that, it was a few years journey, really. The outcome of that was I questioned my sexuality. I questioned whether I had been born a lesbian. And I ended up repenting of that identity and leaving that subculture, and then moving towards embracing femininity and wholeness. And today, years later, I don't experience same-sex attraction, and I'm far away from that world. But when I was in the culture, I was a very staunch feminist. And so Planned Parenthood and their ministry, if you will, to women in America was a major pillar. And the fact that they have moved from really supporting women and women's rights to supporting men as women and their biological rights, and just the confusion over what is a woman is very interesting. Just that's another conversation, but very interesting. And so, yes, we could make the argument, where is the money? And I think that there's a lot more money than we can even begin to imagine in transgender care. Because unlike any other procedure, it creates a patient for life. And, you might, we're not talking typically about just a few surgeries. It's usually quite a few surgeries. And then beyond that, it is medical care for the body to maintain that transition for the rest of that individual's life. And so the financial gain, the financial profit that's possible is much, much greater than a single procedure like an abortion. Um, and we could also bring into the conversation, if we wanted to, transhumanism and where we're going with that. But the fact that right now, I would say in the pregnancy care center space, the biggest issue is in the medicines, that the hormones that are being offered. It's not likely that a care center or an abortion care center could provide surgeries, but they certainly would be able to maintain hormone therapies and follow-up procedures for transition.
Well, first of all, I say thank you for sharing your story. And yeah, thank you for being open and continuing to be open on and authentically sharing a hard story. And I feel like that's something I wish I would know more about, was the hormone blocks and the hormone ads, and when it comes to the long-term effects that has. One thing that is clear is that it looks to me like the enemy is like this lion looking to devour the least powerful or the most vulnerable person in the pack, the one that's by themselves and least likely to fight back, and that's been the unborn for a long time. It's also children. And so I feel like the LGBTQIA plus group has targeted born children who are with partially developed brains, who are not 25 yet. They are probably closer to 7 years old. It seems like that. I'm not quite sure what the age range is, but it just seems like very young, all the way up through pre-puberty and through puberty, maybe post-puberty, that kind of range in age. It also seems like it's almost like there's a merging of these groups, the LGBTQ plus IA group and the abortion advocate, or those who would promote abortion group or accessibility to abortion, and possibly others. But it feels like there's almost like this merging of groups or overlap of groups that may not have been seen or noticed years before. But I feel like right now we're experiencing this merging of groups.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most alarming things that we're watching happening, honestly, is so organizations like Human Rights Campaign. So for a couple of decades at least, if not longer, Human Rights Campaign has been an advocate for the LGBT space. And what we've been watching in the last 5 years at least is they're co-opting racial groups, ethnic groups, and then also abortion advocacies. So if you go to Human Rights Campaign's website, they will say that they are protecting women's rights, that they are advocating for women's rights, particularly in the abortion space. And so, honestly, if you think about the impacts of, I like to say that the sexual revolution is an offshoot of the tech revolution that we're experiencing right now. And, the tech revolution, just like the industrial revolution before it, is causing very great social upheaval. So if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, when we were transitioning from agrarian society into more of a metropolitan-focused state, families were upended. Men, worked out of the home. Women began working out of the home. Like, the Industrial Revolution caused a very great change in our culture. Well, then the same thing is happening with the tech revolution. And like abortion, for example, wouldn't be possible without the tech revolution. The advancements in medical care and science and prescription drugs are all possible as a result of technology. Well, then, with contraception being available, then the sexual revolution really became possible, and we were able to basically subvert the impacts of our sexual desires through medicine or through medical procedures, so that we kind of disconnected from, I would say, even began disconnecting from our bodies as a result. I think it's interesting that one of the outcomes or the fruits of the sexual revolution is actually this very great disconnect that we're experiencing, dissociation we're experiencing in our culture right now, where people don't even know, are they man or woman? Who should they mate with, or other concerns like that. So this dissociation is it's breaking down our culture in many ways. So with that, this conversation over trans care, etc., needs to be part of a restoration project, in my opinion, just on in my opinion, a Christian anthropology, just restoring personhood in America, in a sense. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Can you speak more about restoring? Yeah, so it's interesting. So when you say personhood, I think your perspective was in regards to a man versus woman. Can you tell me more about your the backstory with that word personhood? Because it has a lot of weight in the pro-life and abortion side of things. But I'm curious, before going there, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you were connecting it to the LGBTQ and the man versus woman confusion.
Well, for a long time, pro-life advocates have been saying an embryo is a person, right? An unborn child is a person. And one of the disconnects that we have right now is how much of our bodies are part of our personhood. And so, I mean, we by virtue of cultural change right now, we've kind of virtualized ourselves in a sense. And so we don't see our bodies as part of ourselves. We tend to think that our mind, will, and emotions are the primary aspect of our identity, which is the kind of underlying foundation for transgenderism. Like, I can will to be, irregardless of what my body says, I can will to be something else. And this ideology is really completely different than the LGBT ideology. It's in complete opposition to the LGBT ideology. LGBT ideology says I'm a victim of my body. Trans ideology says I am disconnected. I can vanquish and overcome my body. My body is just an extension of my inner self. And so personhood, in my opinion, involves this integration, where we recognize that our bodies are an integral part of our whole being. And this aligns with the biblical anthropology, that God breathed into our bodies and we became a living soul. The incarnation speaks to our whole personhood as a requirement, or our whole bodies as a requirement for personhood before Jesus. Like, if we only had a soul and that was the most important thing, Jesus wouldn't have come in a body. He wouldn't have had to die on the cross. And so we are just this whole integrated being, and a miracle in that. And our bodies, down to the cellular level, tell us a lot about who we are as men and women and who our heritage is. We get to speak genetically of generations before us. Our whole character, our whole personality is informed by our bodies before it's informed by culture. And so we're in this time where embracing personhood, in my opinion, is about our whole being, the integration of our body, soul, and spirit.
That seems to resonate with messages that I've heard at my church when it comes to the importance of the body being increased or elevated back to where it should be. And yeah, how we're not just made up of mind and spirit, but yet, yeah, the body is integral when it comes to, is part of who we are and who God created. And yeah, God created us as whole creatures reflecting Him. And so it's important to include the body and not to discard it as something that's not valuable or less valuable perhaps.
Or something that we should be able to destroy or create apart from the will of God.
So I guess one of the things I like to do with this podcast, there's a couple of different pillars. One is I like to share things that are helpful to pregnancy clinic directors. I think we probably are simply echoing something that they've already been considering, because I feel like this is a message, but maybe this is probably more direct than some of the echoes that have been going on this need of, talking about providing mental health counseling or psychological counseling for patients that are essentially going to an abortion clinic, or women's clinic, or whatever the name might be. Another pillar is to share something new, and I think we've definitely achieved that by talking about a new topic, and again echoing things that they've probably been seeing and experiencing, which would verify that this is a good thing to talk about. And then one of the pillars is highlighting God's fingerprints on a given topic. So I'd like to go there. And even though I think we probably touched on that, but can you share a story, whether it's your own story or a different story, where you have seen God's fingerprints work in this space, and it just simply as a way of highlighting God's fingerprints in His work.
Let me share a story of a good friend of mine, Kathy Grace Duncan. So Kathy Grace is our director of gender advocacy, and she travels with me quite a lot, just addressing public policy matters, sharing her testimony so that people have a greater understanding of what's involved with the trans experience. So Kathy Grace is a little bit older than me. She's around 50, I believe. And she, so when she was born, her family, her parents had a disconnect, and her father was abusive towards her mother. And growing up, she watched them fighting and her father's abuse, and she made a subconscious, and I say subconscious because she didn't really recognize it until she was an adult. So she made a subconscious vow in that season as a child, that she would be a protector of women. And that became, I'll be a better man than my father. And so, as a 7, 8, 9-year-old, she was acting out as a boy, wanting to be a boy, playing like she was a boy. And then in school, she was able to orchestrate kind of a double personality, where she had friend groups that knew her as a boy and friend groups who knew her as a girl. And this was kind of a hidden life of hers. Well, then when she graduated from high school, she left home and she came out as trans and began transitioning. And she fully surgically transitioned and began living as a man. And so if you looked at Kathy Grace when she was about 20, you would have seen her mustache, She was beginning male pattern baldness. Like, you wouldn't have, by just looking at her, known that she was biologically a woman. And so she was dating women, and at one point went to a church with her girlfriend, and there was an altar call at the church, and she went forward to be saved, and she expected, like, okay, suddenly everything's going to change. I'm going to, lightning from heaven, something dramatic is going to happen. And that didn't happen. And she went forward a couple of times, actually, and ended up speaking to the pastor and then confessing that she believed she was a man trapped in a woman's body. And when that pastor heard, he asked her to leave and stop attending church there. And so several years later then, another opportunity to start attending church happened. She had been dating another woman, went through kind of a bad breakup. And that bad breakup kind of led her to, I think I'm going to try to go back to church. So she started attending a new church. She became really active in that church. She became a youth leader in that church and was working with junior high age boys. Now, still, no one knew that she was biologically a woman. And she was super popular because she's really fun and gregarious and doing great in ministry. And she had a mentor. And she started feeling from the Lord this prompting to accept the truth that she was a biological woman. And she didn't know what to do, because she had a track record of, well, I guess my life in church is over. And confessed that to her mentor, and her mentor said, well, let's see. Let's talk to the pastor. And so she met with the pastors of the church and confessed. But this time, when she confessed, she said, I'm a woman living as a man. So it was a different confession that she had. And when she declared that confession, she'll say she just felt the power of the Holy Spirit just hit her and fill the room. And the pastor said to her, essentially, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help you, but we're going to stand with you in this season. And so she agreed to immediately start backing out of the ministry leadership responsibilities she had had. She became open about her identity. And then ultimately, she was connected to a ministry in Portland Fellowship, who offered to take her in while she detransitioned. So Portland Fellowship is a ministry, part of a network called Restored Hope Network, which some of your leaders could connect to. They have a really great network of counselors that you could tap into. But so this ministry took her in. It's a live-in program, and she was there for a couple of years as she detransitioned. It took a while for her to detransition completely. But then on top of that, it took a while for her to learn even who she was as a woman, if you can imagine. Like, if she had so fully rejected womanhood, reintegrating yourself or reintroducing yourself to that idea, I don't know if she maybe had ever felt like a woman or as a girl in her life. And so it was a novel idea for her. And so she had many women surrounding her, mentoring her. She went through a really intentional discipleship process. I don't think she would say she went through clinical counseling. She went through discipleship with the Lord. And so through prayer and through learning to hear the Lord, she detransitioned. Today, she has been leading women's ministry for several years in Portland Fellowship. And, she no longer experiences same-sex attraction, and she no longer experiences any discordance with her gender. So the experience, I could say, of young children having an experience where they are caused to question their identity in their sexuality or in their gender, is super common. I know of a young woman who, when she was probably 3 or 4, now, once again, this is something that she has realized and unpacked as an adult. She's in her late 20s now, as an adult, looking back on her childhood. So when she was about 3 or 4, her dad was giving her a bath. And as he was helping her get out of the bathtub, she slipped and fell, and she cut the area around her vagina, and it was bleeding. And probably her father, to protect her, he said, stay right here, and went to get her mom so that she would have her mom looking instead of him. But she perceived that as, there's something wrong with me. He won't look at me. And so she felt ashamed then, from then on, that she was a girl and not a boy, because it caused a disconnect. She perceived it was just a self-perceived disconnect between her and her father that lasted all the way until she was in her 20s. It wasn't a broken relationship with her father. It was, because she deeply desired connection with him, and her family life was not, it wasn't fraught with abuse like Kathy Grace's. But that one moment of fear and doubt was enough to set her on the trajectory of self-rejection. And with no one to know how to respond or to help her navigate, how do you get back to understanding what's underneath this sense of complete disconnect from your gender identity? It really took for her, once again, this place of prayer and connection with the Lord to understand what happened, what was I believing, and what then do I do? And so we're in an interesting time when children really are being attacked, families are being attacked, and I would say the number one place of risk is in the relationship between parents and children.
No, thank you for sharing those stories. One thing that I'm reflecting on is when it comes to Kathy's story, and it sounds like she had a really hard experience the first time that she tried to share, but at least with the second time, one of the verses that we often reflect on when it comes to women seeking healing from abortion, or seeking healing from really anything, when it comes to spiritual healing and other types of healing, I suppose, as well, which would be James 5:16, which says, confess your sins one to another so that you may be healed, and the prayers of a righteous person availeth much. And so by sharing with someone who is trusted and who is willing to pray, and a good person to ask to pray, I think is a really good recipe for finding healing. And taking that step of saying it out loud to that person really, I think, removes a foothold, or it removes the power that sin holds over someone until that confession is made. Or it's a very incredible way.
I feel like it's so important, like you're saying. The other ministry leader here at Changed, Ken, he says this line that I think is absolutely pertinent. You really can't be loved unconditionally until people know your condition. And so, a lot of the time for us who are in the LGBT community, we keep silent. We're out of fear. We keep silent about what we're experiencing and believing, out of fear of rejection mainly. But what happens then is that silence actually seems to confirm the rejection that we're perceiving. So we perceive the fact that our parents or our friends or whomever are not addressing our deep emotional pain. We perceive that as rejection, even though we actually haven't confessed to having that pain. And so there's so much, the Lord's wisdom in confession is so important.
Yeah, I agree. And then the other thing that you said when you were mentioning the second experience for Kathy when you said that pastor said, "We will stand with you." So last night I went to church, and Pastor Susan Seepin at my church, she talked about the book of Ephesians, and we're going through a series where we're over, every summer we go over one book per Sunday. And this is a series we've been doing for about 5 years. It's not going straight through, but spreading it out. And so Susan really wanted to preach on Ephesians because in the past she actually memorized the entire book of Ephesians because she likes it so much. And so if anyone was ready to preach on Ephesians, it was Susan. And her sermon was really incredible because she knew it at such an incredible depth. And she's one of the way in which she summarized Ephesians was into 3 parts. The first several chapters were about sitting. And then the next portion was about walking. And then the third portion was about standing. And sitting represented preparing, or in my mind, I was thinking of resting, but I think it's preparing. And then walking is a matter of changing, like if you're walking towards the right direction. And it also, standing is when you have to take a stand for someone. And sitting, walking, and standing are also can be done in an evil way, according to Psalms 1. When it comes to sit, don't sit with the scornful, or anyways, the sitting, walking, and standing in Psalms 1 represents how it can be done in an evil way. But Ephesians talks about how sitting, walking, and standing can be done in a righteous for God way. And it just struck me that you used that word stand just brought in a lot of meaning when you said that he said, "We'll stand with you," because that's really what we're preparing to do, is to stand for people who need, standing in that spot with the armor of God. Because that standing portion of Ephesians talks about equipping with the armor of God to be able to stand.
So good. Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. And in this season, we so need mature spiritual leaders to take that stand. And, from my vantage point, I have so many people who have been in the pro-life space. And from my vantage point, you have a well-worn pathway of strategies, but then also maturity in the movement that can make that stand. And if anybody ever needed it, it is children who are faced with identity politics today.
Yeah, and it feels like, the children are, when it comes to school systems, when it comes to culture, when it comes to, so it just seems like, and maybe we're in the season of sitting and walking and getting, so that we can stand. But partly, we need to do all 3. We need to do what's right for the moment, and essentially, being equipped to stand for children who are vulnerable. And in those years of between the ages of 7 to 9 seem like the most impactful years that will direct someone's, where they go as an adult. Those years are critical. And if the enemy is attacking those years, the enemy is going to see fruit in the later years of life. And so we really need to identify and, not give room to the enemy to provide that bad direction during those 7 to 9-year-old years.
Boy. And so much sexual abuse happens in that time as well. And if there's any sexual abuse or molestation, so because we are in just sex culture, children as young as 7 are being introduced to sex. So once you start to sexualize children at that age, then you set a pattern, a trajectory for them for the rest of their lives. And if they are believing, I personally think it's unethical for anyone to affirm LGBT or T identity in a child who hasn't gone through puberty. Because who can know if, LGBT is sexual, and prepubescent children are not geared, they're not mature enough to be having those feelings. So that 7 to 9 year old period is a highly sexually charged period right now in the United States. That's when most kids are being introduced to porn. Many kids are being transitioned into, and I don't mean from a transgender posture, but transitioned into more mature levels of sex ed curriculums in their school. And so it is a pivotal time. But I would say all of the years, because many transgender identifying people would tell you that they started doubting or questioning their gender as early as they can remember. And when I've talked to counselors and psychological professionals about that, they tend to believe it's because their attachment issues. So early childhood attachment issues. So where an infant has not received the kind of attention from both parents that infant really needed in order to develop in a healthy way emotionally. And so our our mandate really is to restore family so that women can feel confident in, being women all the way to being mothers and cherishing that role and everything that it requires, so that they don't have the demand of just rushing away from having a child, but can really nurture it early in their lives. Because so many of us, we have issues in our sexual identity because of those early childhood years. I think I wanted to say, because you opened with, where's the network that we can find? So I want to speak to that for a minute, because I maybe brushed you off, or you might have sensed that I brushed you off with that by saying there isn't one, or there aren't many. There are developing networks that are helping people detransition, but right at the moment, one of the dramas in that is the space for counselors who are willing to walk with individuals who are questioning their sexuality has been under attack for decades. Starting with the 70s, when the LGBT movement, the Stonewall movement, began attacking the American Psychological Association. Research on emotional care for people who experience same-sex feelings or gender incongruence has really been twisted by LGBT activism. So, there isn't much professional care offered to someone who does not want the feelings. And most of the counselors who would be willing to be in that space are Christian. But that space, as I said, is heavily attacked because of legislation and public policy in the anti-discrimination space. And so you have to look for organizations that have strong Christian biblical sexual ethics for counselors, but they are certainly that network, that awareness of the relationship, particularly of trauma to transgender identity, trauma and other comorbidities like autism to the transgender reality, is meaning that more and more and more counselors are engaging that space. And so I expect to see in the next 5 years a really obvious response to detransitioning. Meanwhile, I think it's up to Christians to find their networks of Christian counselors, like the American Association of Christian Counselors, who do hold spaces for people who are wanting to align with a biblical sexual ethic on these topics, to help them detransition. But it isn't just psychological care that a detransitioner needs. A detransitioner is going to need a multidisciplinary approach because they've affected their bodies as well. And so you'll have to be able to coordinate with local endocrinologists who would be willing to facilitate kind of the medical practices around hormone therapies, as well as general practitioners, just to address the overall impacts of those drugs on people. And of course, the more dramatic or more invasive their transition, the greater the measure of care is going to be needed. So some some procedures, like a phalloplasty, for example, are going to require very specialized care. So I think we're going to have to be eyes wide open, looking for organizations. A good one to follow is the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, and I'll send you a few links so that you can include those with this podcast. SEGM, GenSpect, but also organizations that have been around for a long time, like Living Waters or Restored Hope Network, us at Changed Movement, ministries that are addressing this, so that everyone receives all the care, all the kinds of care from a holistic approach that they need to be restored.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for just sharing all this insight and this wisdom. Would you help us close the podcast by praying, and just with the expectation that those who are listening will be able to pray as they're commuting and listening to this podcast?
Yeah, I'd love to. I appreciate that. Thank you. Father, we come today to you through the beauty and wisdom of your Son and the sacrifice of Jesus. And Lord, I pray that in this season you are raising up spiritual leaders and practical leaders who can navigate this movement. The impacts of the transgender movement on our culture are so great, but Father, we know that you have a greater plan. And so, Lord, because you're able to make beauty out of ashes, I just thank you, Father, that you are releasing over pregnancy care directors and over the center staff vision and strategy and unusual pioneering ideas that will address this need and become a safety net, a safety net and a place of security for people who are wanting to backpedal on beliefs that they've had in the past, so that they can receive wonderful care, nurture, and complete restoration. In Jesus' name, amen.
Our sponsors include Heritage House, Patriot Insurance, and iRapture.com.
The Pro-Life Team podcast is a ministry of iRapture.com.
If you would like to explore making a donation or becoming a sponsor, or have a recommendation for who would be a good guest on the podcast, please contact us at hello@prolife.team.
Shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green. He leads me by quiet blue. Yeah, though I walk through darkest valleys, you are near me. Your protection and guidance are comforting me everywhere that I go. You refresh